iExplore.
Hey everyone, Lucas from iExplore here. Today I'd like to give you 7 tips for color digital photography, and in particular for editing color photography. And these are tips that are not necessarily revolutionary or secret or anything like that. They are just basically 7 things that I keep in mind for my photography. So they're very important for me. They may or may not apply to the kind of work you do, but you know, I hope you find them useful. Just a quick thing, there is an accompanying blog post for this information, so if you want more details and more about my way of thinking rather than just the specific technical bits, check in the description for a link to the blog post. All right, so let's jump into it. All right, everyone, so the first tip is actually, I think the most important one out of all of them. So I'm going to go right to the most important tip. And that is to always be sure to change your color profile, okay, or at least necessarily change it, but make sure you have one that is ideal for the photo that you're editing. So here I have a photo. This photo is completely unedited right now. This is a raw shot. Everything here, see in the basic pane, is set to 0, right? And the first thing that I'm going to do, okay, is I'm going to check this. So here we have the profile, and it's currently Adobe Standard, and you can customize this. So if I click on Browse, I can, there's all kinds of stuff. See camera matching, you can do flat, portrait, vivid, all this stuff. I selected my favorite, so I only really have Standard, Adobe Standard, Camera Standard, and Monochrome. Sometimes I'll use black and white. It's very rare, but I have it there. So basically I have 2 options when it comes to color. So on Adobe Standard, it looks like this, and then on Camera Standard, it looks like that. And you might think, well, that's a pretty subtle difference. I'm going to go back and forth. Okay, and the colors themselves, like on average, are not too different. You'll notice that, but actually in this case, I find Camera Standard is a little more saturated. But I often find that actually Adobe is the one that's more saturated. It kind of depends on, on the photo. This photo is from a D850, where most of my other photos are from my D4. But I'll show the other examples in a second. But here's the main issue. This is why it's important to make sure this is correct. At least on my camera, and I think it'll depend on Canon, Sony, Fuji, all those other cameras, but on my Nikon, look at the neon over here. So these very saturated colors like this red, on Adobe Standard, they look a little bit strangely washed out. And when I go to Camera Standard, notice how it becomes red as that neon really was out there. Okay, so I find the camera profile, the one that's actually matched to the camera, so like I said, when you go to browse here, you would go to camera matching, and these are the ones that are kind of built into your camera, right? These are a little bit more accurate, okay? So let me show you some more examples of this, okay? These are all unedited shots. So here's another one. This one's already on Camera Standard. If I put it on Adobe, look what happens to the blues up here. You see this weird transition from this blue to this blue? That's odd. That's not what it looked like, okay, when I was there. If I put it on Camera Standard, look at that, much more natural transition. And same thing here in the bigger sign. You can see the difference there. It's like kind of okay in Adobe, and then in camera it looks really nice and smooth. And then when you edit these photos, so if I click on the edited version, see I've upped the contrast. It's not a huge difference, right? But I've upped the contrast, I've brought out the shadows, and I strengthened the colors a little bit. And you can really see here, for example, even on Camera Standard, you're starting to get this slight kind of overexposure in those blues. But watch what happens when I put it on, on Adobe. Okay, if I put it on Adobe, that actually doesn't look too bad, although it does look a little oversaturated to me. But look up here. Let's again, back. This is camera. This nice, vivid, beautiful blue, and then this strange, like deep blues with this weird faded white-looking, kind of grayish-looking here. And then especially you can see here, if I zoom in all the way on that. Yeah, here we go. Zoom in. Blowing this up, but just so you know very clearly what I'm talking about here. You see this weird transition, while on Camera Standard, much better. So there you go. There's a couple more examples here. I'll show you this photo as well. This is where I find Adobe to be more saturated. This is what I was saying. So if you look at this lamp here on Adobe Standard, it's really red to the point that you can't see detail in there. But when I put this on Camera Standard, it's still red, but you can see much more details. Okay, and then this results in files that are easier to work with, if I start from Camera Standard. So here's the an edited version of this on Camera Standard. Okay, let's go back to the other one just to compare. the difference here. So this is unedited, edited. I didn't do anything crazy to it, just brought out the shadows, but you can see the colors are still beautiful. If I put it on Adobe Standard, it's a little bit too much. And also notice the red, it doesn't look red anymore. It starts to look a little bit pink or magenta. Okay? So there you go. Biggest tip, most important tip, tip number one, mess with the color profile, make sure it's the best one for your particular shots, and look for the details, especially these very saturated colors. Alright, tip number two. Tip number two is fine-tune your white balance. Okay, now I think everybody's already playing with the white balance and making sure it's all set up, you know, just the way they like it. But more specifically, what I'm going for when I'm fine-tuning my white balance is I'm trying to go for color contrast. So I want colors to pop. So for example, right now this photo, it's on 4,700, and this photo is already edited. I did a lot of other edits on this image, but the white balance is really crucial here. Let's say I go extreme, I go like 3,200. Okay, that obviously looks very vivid. Like it's really blue. Wow, so blue, and it it looks impressive in some ways. I mean, and I think online you'll see a lot of people go for this kind of look, like very blue or very magenta or whatever. But for me, this is not what I use the white balance for. When I'm adjusting my white balance, certainly I want bright, vivid colors like this, but I also want to have color contrast. So I want the reds to pop against the blues. So for example, here, the blue and the red and this red over here and this blue over here are extremely distinct from each other. If I press undo and go back to this, this deep blue, you see the blues, the reds still stick out, but they're kind of less red now, right? Because of the extreme white balance. And the blues all sort of blend together. Okay, and same goes for the other direction. If I go to like 6,000, then the reds and the yellows start to kind of lose their distinction from each other. So of course those are extreme examples, but if I go to 4,400, you see it's starting to get a little bit too blue. So I'm usually just fine-tuning this, by just going up, like 50 at a time using the up and down arrow keys on the keyboard, and until I find a value that just looks just right. So I'm looking at my monitor and I'm really paying attention to this. And same goes for the tint. Right now it's on 18. This is going between green and magenta. If I go to 0, see it's much more green. If I go to -20, super green, looks kind of cool. I can see how this is appealing, but it's not what I'm going for, right? I'm going for, like I said, color contrast. So this is on 36. Again, it's too high. The original value I had here was 18, and that feels just right. Okay, so tip number 2 is fine-tune your white balance for color contrast. Okay, tip number 3 is the Calibration tab, which is over here. So this tab, I don't do actually too much on this tab. I used to play around with these sliders a lot, but I found that often they gave kind of unnatural results. So they should be used with caution. But I really do like the shadow tint. I think this is such a simple thing, and it can add a lot of depth to your image, at least on the RAWs that my camera produces. Okay, and I use a Nikon D4 and a Ricoh GR2. But both of these cameras I will often increase the shadow tint to the magenta side. So as you can see on this photo, it's only +5. If I go to 0, it's very subtle. It might not even come out that great on this video capture, but the shadows just look a little bit too greenish here, and here they're a little more purple, and to me that just looks a little bit more contrasty. Okay. If I go to 20, you'll see what I mean though, to really exaggerate it. Let's go to 40. You see the shadow parts of the image, the dark parts of the image start to turn pretty magenta. This is too much. This goes referencing tip number 1. This is too much color cast, and I want color contrast. But the right amount, like a smidgen of it, maybe I usually go around 10-ish, up to 10. Occasionally some photo I'll do 20. For this one I think that's too much. In this case I went 5. But looking at it right now, my taste changes from day to day. I kind of like 10. Maybe 8 would have been okay. All right. Another quick thing, I will sometimes change the green primary more towards the bluish side, I guess, the teal side. So I'll go like +40 here. And watch what happens. Interestingly, this is the green channel, but watch what happens to the reds. You see how the reds, especially like you can see this down here, just sort of pop out a little more. I find this gives it a nice look in some cases. This is not the best example photo for this. Let's see what it looks like on this one. Oh, this one's already +20, you see? So if I go here +60, you can see how that just kind of pops out the reds a little bit. But it also makes them a bit more orangish rather than reddish. Okay, so these two things are the third tip. And of course play with the other ones too, but those are the two that I use. Alright, tip number 4 is split toning, which a lot of people use these days. Again, not a secret or anything like that. But again, just going back to the constant theme through this is that I'm never trying to create strong color casts. I'm using everything, including the split toning, to add color contrast. So in this case, on this image, as you can see, I have it on the highlights for about 200, so bluish color. So usually I use 220, so let's go with that for this example, just because that's very common. I like 220. It's a nice deep blue. And in this case, the saturation is 30. And then for the shadows, I tend to go around 40 with a saturation of usually more like 10. So this is kind of standard for me. Let's say 20 here. And then this can be on 0 for it. So this will be a typical split toning for me. And as you can see, if I turn it on and off, it's really subtle. You can barely see the difference. But I do see a difference. The highlights get a little bluer. All right, the shadows get a touch warmer. And just to then make it really extreme to make it more obvious, that's on 80, and now the shadows is on 80. That's a little too much. Let's go to 40 here. So just to show so you can really tell what I'm doing, but like I said, I make it more subtle than this. So you see, this is with no split toning, and this is with bluer highlights and redder shadows. But again, and I find there's more, everything's more samey, and this has more color contrast between the shadows and the highlights. But again, this is too extreme. I would actually do 20 and 10 or so here. And the balance, if I feel like I need a little bit more on the highlight side, I'll usually go up or down on the balance, but this is not crucial. So I use this very subtly and only when necessary. I don't use it for every single photo. Right? In this photo, let's look at this example. How does it look here? I mean, it's extremely subtle. If I crank this up, though, you'll be able to see what it's doing here. You see, there we go. Especially in the sign, you can see how the sign, like the glow behind the sign here, turns a little more blue. Okay, while the shadows stay pretty warm. So, but like I said, the original one, that's extremely subtle. Again, because I'm trying to bring out the colors that are there. I'm not trying to add any colors. All right, so that's tip number 4, whatever that was, split toning. Okay, and tip number 5 is the color mixer, or also known as HSL, or hue, saturation, and lightness. And honestly, I don't mess with this very often. For example, this photo, I didn't touch it. Everything is zeroed here. But photos like this one that have a lot of colors already in them, sometimes I'll use this to kind of rebalance things. Again, I don't go too crazy. Notice the values are pretty close to 0, minus 20 plus 10. I'm not going crazy here. And honestly, I edited this photo quite a while ago, and I just pulled it up today for the example. And when I kind of compare, I think maybe I went a little bit overboard. Again, I'm going for subtle changes with these things. I don't want to overly kind of, modify the colors in the photo. I want to have what's there and bring it out. But anyway, in this case, I think I mostly achieved that. So you can see I made the blues a little bit less purplish, which is right here. And really, this is actually, I think, the strongest one. If you're going to use any one of these, if I go minus 40, you can really see how the blues really dramatically change. And if you go the other way, it's quite purple. I find on my Nikon, it often comes out a little bit purplish, so I'll sometimes go minus 10 or minus 20 if I feel it necessary. And I think it looks really nice here. The other changes are much more subtle. You can see the aquas doesn't really do much when I change these other things. It's very, very subtle. And then the reds as well. That one's pretty strong. One thing to be careful with here. See if I can make it happen in this image. But if you go too crazy on these, especially if you go in different directions, like if I make this one, plus and this one minus, the transitions between colors can get a little weird. Okay, you can see there's it's subtle, but there's some weird changes here from the blue to the purple. And that's because I made the purples extra magenta, but I made the blues extra aqua or cyan. So they've pulled them away from each other, and that's created this odd separation. So if I go back, see, this is how it should look. You see there's like a blue gradient here that goes from blue to purple to magenta, but when I pull these apart, it's a very sharp boundary. And in this case, it doesn't look too bad because there's actually a line there of the edge of the sign versus the wall. But sometimes this will happen in the middle of an object, like over, a gradient, and then it looks terrible. So just be very careful about this. And so again, I try to make it pretty subtle. I don't make these changes extreme, if I even use this one at all. Okay? So that's the HSL color mixer tip. Okay, the second to last tip is color space. And in Adobe Camera Raw, you can change the color space in which you are working. Now, most people have monitors that only really show the sRGB color space. The other major color space is Adobe RGB. I don't want this video to be all about color spaces. That's something you got to look up somewhere else. That's a whole giant can of worms. But basically the tip is that if you don't have a monitor that can handle Adobe RGB, then don't use Adobe RGB. Make sure you click on this thing at the bottom and go in here and change it to sRGB. And I hope this comes out of the video, but you can see the difference on my monitor is extreme. The reds are much more subdued, the blues as well a little bit when I go to sRGB. But that doesn't matter. If they look, whatever it looks like on your monitor. But the important thing is that if you're editing as sRGB, everyone else will see pretty much the same colors on their monitors. But if you're editing in Adobe RGB, you might get colors that look good, and then later when you upload it online, things look a little bit weird or disappointing. So generally, unless you have a special monitor, I do recommend to be editing in sRGB. Okay, so a quick tip there, make sure that that's set to the correct color space. Alright guys, now for the 7th tip, it's a little bit different from the other ones, probably a bit more controversial, and it is don't use presets. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel bad if you are using presets. I can see how they are fine to use, and I get the motivation behind them. But for me, I never used them. I never was interested in using them, and the reason for that is that when I'm editing my work, I'm trying to create my own unique vision, my own unique way of showing people how I see the world, right? And part of that is editing. I would say these days with digital photography, editing is something like 50%, maybe 30%. I don't know what percent, but a significant part of the equation. And if you're leaving that part of that up to basically somebody else's creativity in the form of presets, I find you're just doing yourself a disservice, and it's counterproductive. So I don't use them. I also don't sell them for that reason. And I feel like, I encourage other people to do the same, to kind of develop your own style by implementing the ideas that I already shared in the video and by experimenting and coming up with your own ways of editing. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting and informative. Please also be sure to check out the link in the description for the blog post that goes into more detail about all this stuff, and also there's more sample photos there. As always, also please subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, and remember always, challenge your eye.